President Trump went to Sharm El-Sheikh, Egypt, to a peace conference. This is President Trump and world leaders signing. You see the dictator of Azerbaijan there on the left side of the screen, and you see the jackass in charge of the UK, Keir Starmer, over on the right side of the screen. A bunch of Arab leaders and world leaders that all came together, everybody from Italy to Spain to Qatar and UAE and a bunch of places. But so there were two entities that were noticeably absent from this quote unquote peace deal, and that was both Israel and Hamas. The two parties that are fighting are not there signing the peace deal. The peace deal is being signed by a bunch of countries that are not actually involved, except the United States. The U.S. is involved just in terms of we've got troops on the ground. We've been supporting Israel with military equipment and intelligence and things like that for the entirety of this war. If anybody has any skin in this game, it's definitely the United States. Now, President Trump went on to be somewhat effusive in his praise for Qatar and for Turkey. President Trump went so far as to sort of admit, well, Erdogan is not really a very good guy. He's a strong guy, and I like strong guys. I don't think there's anything wrong with liking strength, but there's two kinds of strength. There's righteous strength and evil strength. And if somebody is a strong man, but they're evil, probably that's not the kind of guy you want to be friends with. But President Trump doesn't differentiate. And so here's what he had to say about Turkey.
Another man who's been a friend of mine for a long time. I don't know what it is. I like the tough people better than I like the soft, easy ones. I don't know what the hell that is. It's a personality problem, I suspect. But this gentleman from a place called Turkey has one of the most powerful armies actually in the world. It's much more powerful than he even lets known. If you look at some of the recent conflicts, he was at the top of them and he was winning them, and he did win them. He doesn't want any credits. He just wants to be left alone. He's a tough cookie, but he's been my friend. And every time I've ever needed him, he's been there for me. I thank President Erdogan, Turkey. When NATO has a problem with him, because he is difficult, they call me. They said, would you do me a favor? Could you speak to Erdogan? And I do.
So let's break down. I mean, we all know President Trump just kind of says stuff, and he's kind of a ready, fire, aim kind of guy. He maybe doesn't think through everything that he's saying. But what he just said there, if you break that down, is that Erdogan is a pretty tough guy to deal with, and NATO has a lot of problems with Erdogan. Why is that? Because Erdogan is supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. He is supporting ISIS. We have proof of them giving millions of dollars to ISIS, sheltering ISIS fighters, and repurposing ISIS into the Free Syrian Army and now the Syrian National Army, and supporting terror across Turkey. We've got problems with Turkey supporting Azerbaijan in their genocidal war against the Armenians, and even sending troops and drones into Armenia to kill Armenian Christians. So when NATO has a problem, they call President Trump because Erdogan's not playing ball. And so President Trump calls Erdogan, and Erdogan will moderate his activities if President Trump asks nicely. Is that something to brag about? That this guy's such a bad actor that they got to call on President Trump to see if they can get him to rein it in a little bit and maybe not be quite as evil. Well, he's been fighting in Syria and murdering Syrian civilians, Kurdish civilians. He said he's currently occupying the northern part of Rojava, which is the eastern part of Syria. He's got thousands of troops in Syria right now. He's been supporting HTS and their takeover of Syria, been involved in the conflict against Armenia. This is not a good person. He has jailed more journalists than any other country on planet Earth. I personally cannot go to Turkey because I will end up in prison. He did also praise Qatar for making this peace deal happen, which again does not include any of the players who are fighting. And President Trump talks about the fact that he just brought peace in the Middle East for the first time in 3,000 years. Maybe not quite. Here's what he had to say about that.
This is a tremendous day for the world. It's a tremendous day for the Middle East. And you can see that this is probably the greatest assemblage of countries in terms of wealth and power maybe ever assembled. And it's just an honor to be a part of it. We're going to be signing a document that's going to spell out a lot of rules and regulations and lots of other things. And it's very comprehensive. The hostages, as you know, were let go on time, on schedule. The very sad situation of bodies, they're being sought out, and they're working with many different people, finding some were brought in and some were not. And they're working out to find out where those bodies are. It's hard to believe that you even have to say something like that. But what's not sad is that we have finally, after 3,000 years to 500 years, but whatever it is, it's a lot. But we had a lot of good talent. Steve Witkoff, Jared, and Marco, and Pete, and General Kane was so great. John Ratcliffe was incredible. We had an amazing array of talent, and we were helped by, in particular, the countries represented at this table. And without you, this wouldn't have happened. And I just want to thank you very much. That's Qatar. And
He's saying that he's very happy with Qatar. Is it very happy with Qatar, the country that was harboring the Hamas terror leaders and is still to this day? How quickly would this war have gotten over if instead of buddying up to Qatar, President Trump had brought the full force of his will against Qatar at the beginning to give up those Hamas leaders, kick them out, arrest them, whatever, to stop supporting the terror? Now, it took Israel and the United States almost 2 years to actually finally go hard against Iran, which was funding all this to begin with. Iran and Qatar. Qatar gave billions of dollars to Hamas in Gaza that Hamas used to build tunnels and to build rockets and to amass weaponry and things like that. So even if I may be critical of some of the things President Trump said, I say, let him have this. I'm not critical that they decided to do this. And I'm not critical that he decided to make it all about him in a way and claim to have brought peace in the Middle East after 3,000 years. I think that definitely remains to be seen. But it bears pointing out that there are still hostages in Gaza. Hamas is already violating the agreement because they've only returned 4 of the 28 deceased hostages' bodies. Now, as President Trump said, we know that Hamas is unable to find all of them. I imagine they know where more than 4 of them are. And so the question is, why aren't these being returned? Hamas had alerted the IDF that they had some more bodies that were ready to be turned over. And so the Red Cross was going in there to recover those. So it looks like we'll get some more of them back shortly. But as these world leaders were meeting around the table in Sharm El-Sheikh, Hamas spoke publicly with the press and said, we're not agreeing to any disarmament, but that was one of the central tenets of this agreement. To further demonstrate that fact, Hamas has started a violent purge of any of their opposition in the Gaza Strip, including massive street executions. Here's a still frame. Obviously, we can't show you what happened after this, but you can imagine they executed 7 guys. You see the people around them, they're all pumping their fists in the air and they're screaming, God is great. Let's murder some people here. This is fantastic. And these guys they said that they were somehow disloyal to Hamas. So, as a side note, Christiane Amanpour of CNN got herself in a little bit of hot water.
I think for sure people who start to talk to the hostages who've only just been released will find that it will take a long time for them to recover physically but also mentally. It's been a terrible 2 years for them because not only are they there, they're probably being treated better than the average Gazan because they are the pawns and the chips that Hamas had. Now Hamas has given up all its leverage, by the way, by giving them all up.
Some people really took umbrage with that because your average Gazan was not being held in a cave for 2 years and being made to dig his own grave while he was being starved intentionally. And so she had to come out and apologize for saying that. And look, obviously, from looking at the hostages that were released yesterday, from hearing their stories of torture and abuse at the hands of Hamas, they were not being treated better than the average person in Gaza. Life might have been tough in Gaza, but it wasn't that tough. Okay, yeah, this is Israel redeploying. I showed you that the other day. Israel has pulled back to that line, the yellow line they pulled back to. So Israel still controls that much of Gaza. And that's not going to change because if Hamas does not give up their weapons and disband, then the Israelis are going to stay in 51% of Gaza, and Gaza is going to be 51% smaller than it was at the beginning of this war. It's going to stay that way. On top of that, again, Hamas not giving up its weapons, murdering people in Gaza. They're still stealing the aid. Israel was supposed to open up the Rafah crossing into Egypt and allow unlimited truckloads of aid to flow into Gaza. Israel has said now they're not going to do that until Hamas holds up its end of the bargain and releases the rest of the hostages at the very least. So yesterday, Israel identified 2 of the 4 deceased hostages that were turned over. They're still doing DNA analysis on the other 2 and trying to make sure they know who they are. Hamas told them which 4 they were, but they have to check. They have to make sure. Okay. So now let's go through the points of this plan because I think it's important to clarify what it was that all of these countries signed. Because again, Israel and Hamas were not involved. So, what does this peace plan say? What was the document that President Trump signed yesterday along with those Arab leaders? So, number one is it opens by welcoming the truly historic commitment and implementation by all parties to the Trump peace agreement. Of course, it had to be named after President Trump. He loves to put his name on everything. I don't actually have a problem with that. It's kind of what he's good at. It's called marketing. But all of the parties had to acknowledge the historic commitment by all parties to the Trump peace agreement. And then it pledged to implement the agreement to ensure opportunity for all people, Palestinians and Israelis, and then made references to humanitarian care, reconstruction, and stability. Then it mentioned that fundamental human rights should be protected, their dignity upheld, and then the respect for heritage and sacred connections must be paramount, whatever that exactly means. I'm not sure. Then it emphasized that meaningful progress emerges through cooperation and sustained dialogue. That's diplomat speak for thank you, Captain Obvious. And strengthening bonds among nations serves the enduring interests of regional and global peace. It's being reported that roles will at some point be allocated for oversight, monitoring, and stabilization. That'll probably involve Turkey, Egypt, Qatar, maybe Jordan, and some other local actors. It puts together a framework that imagines a technocratic transitional authority, which excludes Hamas. It says that Gaza is going to be watched over by a quote unquote board of peace or similar international body. We're going to appoint a board of peace and they're going to oversee Gaza in a technocratic way as a transitional authority to apparently eventually offering new elections to the people in Gaza. What happens then? What happens if the people in Gaza elect Hamas again? Are we going to stand by that? It also calls for Egypt and Jordan to assist in training Palestinian security forces, and it says that international stabilization forces may be deployed. Sounds like the multinational force and observers in the Sinai Peninsula. So maybe just expand the multinational force and observers and send them into Gaza. It envisages Israel retracting into further and further lines back behind where they can currently control, giving up more territory as a condition for this to continue. If Hamas abides by the points of this plan, then Israel will agree to continue to pull back. They're never going to give up all of Gaza right now. That's not in the cards. Even the final step, it says eventually they would leave Gaza altogether, but it doesn't actually specify when that would happen or how that would happen. It just talks about an eventuality. The text of this agreement also allows for the possibility of a Palestinian state in the future after reform processes take place, not of Hamas, but of the Palestinian Authority. So if you understand, the Palestinian Authority does not govern anything in Gaza, and they haven't for many years. The Palestinian Authority exists in Judea and Samaria. They are separate from Hamas. They're at odds with Hamas in a lot of ways. What they're trying to do is they're trying to extend the Palestinian Authority's rule into Gaza at some point in the future. But right now, the people in Gaza are saying absolutely not. We won't accept the Palestinian Authority. If you talk to any Arabs in the West Bank, they don't like the Palestinian Authority. They say they're so corrupt, they just steal all the aid money. And so we don't like those guys at all. So this agreement that was signed yesterday talks about the Palestinians could possibly get their own state if the Palestinian Authority can submit to reform processes that will make it better. Right now, even the Palestinian Authority is not on board with that. I don't believe there were any representatives of the PA at this signing either. Now, the preamble to this signing, this document, also includes references to the historical and spiritual significance of the land and tries to acknowledge that it is holy to both all three: Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. One interesting thing about this document is that it doesn't even mention Hamas when it talks about the governance roles in Gaza. Specifically excludes Hamas from direct control of Gaza when under this transitional authority. So far, Hamas has not agreed to that either. And then in talking about how to implement this, it cites different phases, like first and second phase, and talks about rules and regulations to do this. But here's what it does not do. There are no binding, detailed budget commitments for reconstruction or aid. It does talk about that partner countries, which would include the United States, will commit to give aid to Gaza to help rebuild with the rebuilding process. But it doesn't obligate any amount of money. It's likely that the United States is going to end up paying for a whole lot of this. But so will Qatar, and so will Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries as well. Now, there's no comprehensive enforcement or verification mechanism spelled out either. So it doesn't talk about who verifies any of this stuff happening. It doesn't give any recourse if there's violations. It doesn't specify exact withdrawal lines or timelines or troop redeployments or who's got jurisdiction over any of this. It's all just very ambiguous. It doesn't talk about the role of local political actors or how elections might factor into any transition that takes place. It does not address clearly the disarmament of Hamas or what to do with Hamas after they're disarmed, whether or not they can be integrated into any new government entity. And it doesn't compel Israel to fully withdraw from Gaza at all. So there's a lot that this doesn't do. Let's just put it that way. And that's, not all that surprising.